This is Captain Jack Flack. David Osborne, get up to the cockpit right away.
What's the big idea? You don't have to see the kid.
They told me to make sure the boy was all right before we take off.
Come on, you're wanted up front.
But the bomb goes off in less than a minute.
Come on, Junior, now. George! 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 Welcome to the Magic Lantern Podcast, an ongoing informal discussion of the films we love and the things we love about them. I am Erica Long.
And I am Cole Rolane. Each episode of the Magic Lantern will usually be devoted to one film that we alternately select, and we will discuss why it is significant to us. This episode is a little bit different, though. We are at episode 26, which also marks the first anniversary of the show, so we thought we would do something special, and as you probably noticed from our opening playlet, we have some guests with us today. We'll let them introduce themselves.
I'm Brian Douglas.
And I'm Sheila Douglas.
And we are Pathway Comics. We are launching a new comic book this month, The Dimensionals, a all-ages superhero, all-girls superhero team.
And we're excited to be here.
Yes.
We have left it up to Brian and Sheila to choose the film this time, so let's find out what they have in store for us.
We've chosen the 1984 children adventure film, Cloak and Dagger.
Cloak and Dagger from 1984, one of my childhood favorites, a highlight of my childhood. And it was directed by Richard Franklin, written by Tom Holland, also with an uncredited assist by Nancy Dowd, and it stars Henry Thomas, Dabney Coleman, and Michael Murphy.
You are leaving out my favorite, Christina Nigra, as the young sidekick Kim.
When we watched it the first time, you said, "She's in it?"
I did. I was overjoyed to find that this tiny little 8-year-old girl who houses the spirit of an old lady vaudevillian was in this film.
Speaking of old lady vaudevillians, it also has some wonderful small but pivotal roles with Jeanette Nolan and John McIntyre.
Okay, why don't you guys tell us what the film is about?
In this film, a young boy and his imaginary friend end up on the run while in possession of secret government plans encoded on an Atari game cartridge.
Well, the film opens with a very distinct action sequence that's similar to a James Bond infiltrating an embassy type sequence. There are guards that are Russian, the American flag parachute displayed prominently as Jack Flack drops in from the sky. It's very Reagan era, late Cold War, it feels like.
There's even an Arab in there.
And a Nazi. It is very clearly a kid's idea of what early 80s politics and adventure would be all about, or maybe an adult that only watched canon films.
Mm-hmm.
An adult,
Ruskies.
right, exactly. Someone who only took in a steady diet of Chuck Norris.
So right at the beginning, there's kind of an ominous music going with Henry Thomas's name and Dabney Coleman's name, and those are in blue, and then the title comes up of Cloak and Dagger, and the color shifts to red, and the music also shifts at that same moment from ominous to kind of more cheerful and upbeat, and then from then on the words are red, and it's kind of a really stark red, but the words continue red for the rest of the intro credits.
So if we're starting with that red and blue, does that signify American?
Red, white, and blue are the predominant colors that I see throughout the film, so there has to be a major America symbolic component to it. But I think the movie also plays on people's emotional responses to those colors all by themselves. Like, red is interesting because it can be a scary color, but I think mostly in this it's used as a very nostalgic, confident color. Mm.
So Jack infiltrates the embassy, and there is very real danger that he encounters. There's violence that is not shied away from, which is what caught my attention right away, because for a kids movie, this setup immediately suggests that the stakes are going to be a little higher than they are for normal kids entertainment that I'm used to.
There's also violence with a woman character right off the bat.
Exactly.
even though she's kind of a cartoony character, she's dressed real glitzy and has a real stereotypical fancy rich lady outfit on, to where she doesn't seem that realistic a person. The violence does kind of come right out at you.
Yeah. Before any of that violence, there's a hint that things aren't as serious as they appear. With Jack Flack's parachute doesn't just detach, it actually goes into his back, because he's, as we'll learn eventually, he's just a toy, or he is
a character in this
Yes,
adventure.
But even as presented, like his back opens up. It's not like a backpack that he's got on. It happens very quickly, so it's hard to put your finger on, but on repeat viewings, it's his back opening up and his parachute retracting into a cavity in his back.
Much like it would an action figure.
Yeah, like one of those figures that you throw in the air and then a parachute pops out of it and down it comes.
I was more distracted by Dabney Coleman's tight pants. So I was looking at that and thinking,
another superpower.
Hey, Dabney Coleman's got it going on.
Well, clearly, like Brian points out, there are sort of unreal elements to it, and it becomes clear when he begins to try to make his escape why that is. As he is trying to make good his getaway, a pair of large 20-sided die come rolling down the alleyway where he is, and it becomes clear that this whole scenario is a figment of our lead character Davy's imagination.
And we see Davy and his friend Kim and their buddy Morris inside the back room of the Gamekeeper, this interesting game store in San Antonio. And when I was 8 years old, and probably last week, I could not have identified any of the items in that back room, and those dice meant nothing to me.
Mm-hmm.
But I think am I on my own with that one? You were more into those things when you were a kid?
At least when you were that age, you didn't recognize it, but since then, either?
Since then, no.
I don't know.
You pointed out things to me, and I didn't even understand the words you were saying.
When the D&D modules on the display
No
in the
idea.
background.
Oh, yeah.
No clue.
Why were those in the back room? That needed to be out on the sales
Yeah.
floor. My goodness.
I think you may be on your own.
Okay.
Well, I don't have a strong background in understanding games or like gaming games. I recognized a 20-sided die, but I wouldn't have when I was a child. But I didn't see this when I was a child, so.
So I like this setup because it demonstrates right away Davy's creativity and that he's a very imaginative child, and it's all about ingenuity. It sort of strikes me as a very early precursor of how geek culture has taken over. It presaged that by some 30-odd years, where the smart kid is the hero, and all of these things like Atari and Dungeons and Dragons are not something to be ashamed of, but something that a smart, savvy kid takes part in.
And it's interesting that you mention ingenuity, because that's one of my favorite lines in the film when Morris tells Davy, hey, ingenuity and contacts, sometimes that's better than bullets.
We talk about ingenuity and the point that's made in this part of the movie about the boy being so creative and smart. I feel like this part is kind of skewed against the female character of Kim. Growing up with all boys on my street, I really learned the hard way when I was a kid. Boys made the rules of the games and played them to where they were always the winners. And so that scene kind of stings for me because it reminds me a lot of how it was to try to play with boys, because there was no winning. And I feel like Kim, though the actress may just excel at playing this type of character, I think it's probably too quick on that time frame, that director's, that whole point of view, to put her into the role of being a less interesting character than the boy character and a less intelligent, creative protagonist than the boy character, which frustrated me.
Well, I think it's definitely Davy's story, for sure.
Sure.
And I guess I come from the perspective of being an only child, also in a street full of kids, boys and girls though. So I was definitely the one to have to be my own instigator for all of this fun. So the gender role didn't bother me as much, and I try to think of it with the other things that she says later on and how she assists him, and how and many times he has to apologize and treat her as an equal. But I think again about she's been set up a little bit to go along with his schemes, and probably they haven't always worked out, and she's been embarrassed by him before, which is probably a real thing. You know, he can go overboard. So I'm thinking about it as being a relationship almost that is lived in. So she's got this history already with him at 8 years old that she's just not having it.
I think you do perceive, though, some of that being just what she was known for as a character actress, as a younger character actress, and the traits that she demonstrates over and over again in the roles that she's had. She always plays sort of the annoying kid, the thorn in the side, because of, like I mentioned before, her really unique and sort of old-fashioned delivery. Mm-hmm. She belongs to, I know it's kind of a stretch maybe, but a seemingly older tradition when you compare her acting style to Henry Thomas's acting style. He's got a very naturalistic style where she has a very demonstrative, sometimes over-the-top, exaggerated, everything short of just taking straight to the camera. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So she is operating almost in a different acting technique than he is, and it definitely underlines the differences between the two. I, like you, Sela, came to this as an adult, too. I don't have that attachment, that nostalgic feeling of this was one of my favorite adventures as a kid. So I think that colors both of our perceptions of it, since we're coming to it as older cinephiles. So seeing it as an adult, you had that initial reaction to this scene. Did that continue throughout the rest of the movie?
Do you still think she was a drip the whole time?
In a way, I mean, I'll talk more about how her character develops, but I think it's just a pretty common kind of trope even today that the female character gets put into that box of, it's just a stereotype of a woman being like kind of a know-it-all and no fun and so on and so forth. Because I mean, even movies like Harry Potter, Hermione is kind of that same role.
The juvenile equivalent of the nagging wife.
Yeah, she reminded me of like Mrs. Roper or something.
Mrs. Roper had it going on though, just like Gabby Coleman.
So, I mean, I think it's just kind of a sign of the times. The movie was made in 1984. Girls were just not protagonists back then. I mean, there just wasn't the perceived audience for that.
The first thing I can think of that sort of changed that was a few years later. It took until 1987 for there to be a prominent example. I think Adventures in Babysitting might be the first time I can think of when the female protagonist was the one who was spearheading the action, who was in charge. I can't think of a prominent example aside from that, though.
I have to go back to more of the young adult reading when I was a kid at this age and thinking about your Bridge to Terabithia, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. In film, it's really hard to think of young girls really going for it.
Yeah.
So back to the main action. We are still in the back room of the gamekeeper, and Morris is about to give Davy and Kim his secret assignment to go pick up some catalogs and some Twinkies from the Textronics office. And this is when he lets them use walkie-talkies. And the analog that I have to that from when I was a kid, because we couldn't afford walkie-talkies, but I did get a Mr. Microphone. And when Kim picks up the walkie-talkie and is having a great time, I remember just being delighted by my Mr. Microphone and somehow thinking that the world could hear me when I was on it, and I was creating my own adventure once again with that thing.
So that sort of presaged your adventures in podcasting.
It did. And I used that also to give out shout outs to the guys in the convertibles driving by. Isn't that from the Mr. Microphone commercial? But anyway, walkie-talkies are cool. Yeah. So Morris gives Davy and Kim the assignment, and the moment I really love, Davy's not feeling it. It's obviously a way to get them out. And when Morris says, but there's a secret message inside the Twinkies, and Davy says, okay, and gives a little nod. I really like that moment.
It's also foreshadowing.
It is.
As they go off on their adventure, we're able to see their full clothing, and we see that Davy is wearing kind of a classic American boy look with a red collar shirt with blue stripes and bright colored blue jeans, and his friend Kim is wearing a very pale, washed out, light blue, and some also pale shorts with a white belt. Essentially a non-color, but if you had to assign a color, it's light blue. This is a recurring color scheme that we'll see throughout the movie.
And this is the first time that we see San Antonio as the backdrop for this adventure.
Henry Thomas's hometown.
It is. Dabney Coleman is an Austinite, by the way. And with San Antonio, I was really also struck by the fact that the kids have a bus pass, and that's their ticket to adventure, which I could not relate to being a suburbanite kid. We didn't have a bus system that could take us into any town to speak of, so it was really fun to see kids on their own out there having fun.
Yes.
Yeah, Brian grew up with a lot of freedom in Houston.
Yeah, but the great thing about our bus system was that to get to the rest of Houston, you had to go through the very, very worst parts of Houston to where it was not really extraordinarily safe to do so. But you could just go back home and watch Cloak and Dagger again and dream the dream.
Well, this leads me into another larger conversation that I wanted to have about the whole Kids in Jeopardy subgenre of kids films from the 80s. You've got Adventures in Babysitting, like I previously mentioned, and this, The Last Starfighter, which was released as a double bill with this film originally, and things like Monster Squad. And the big one for everyone, The Goonies, probably is the largest example of that, where you've got kids off on their own having exciting adventures and facing real peril that I don't see similar things in film anymore. It may be that I don't watch kids' movies as much, but I'm wondering why that is, why those came to prominence. There's that whole thing about how entertainment reflects our anxieties. How, for instance, a few years ago in the early 2000s, when you had films like Hostel and Turistas, things like that, that reflected our anxieties of how the world perceived us during the Bush administration as we moved abroad. What did this reflect in terms of societal anxiety, aside from the latchkey kid thing?
It was Adam Walsh.
That's a great point.
Adam Walsh was abducted in 1981. This movie came out in 1984. The TV special about Adam Walsh came out in 1983. I mean, it was right in there.
But I don't know. I think this is nuclear war fears. The Cold War was still going on. It was still a very, real threat that, hey, by the way, you might not wake up tomorrow. You never know. It could just happen. And that was coming after 30 years of that had been going on, to where the people that had grown up with that fear were now making movies. It was still ongoing. I mean, it might be like hearkening back to their childhood fears, but definitely children of that era were still under the same gun.
So more than associating this with Goonies, you would put it in with something like War Games, for instance.
Yeah, well, no matter what the MacGuffin is, I guess, of the threat that they're facing, it's still the same thing. It's the life and death struggle. You're right, I don't see that anymore as well in kid movies.
I think it's an interesting point when we mention the Cold War still going on. It almost feels as if it's among that ilk of films from a much earlier time where we all have our part to play. And I love to see kids having that level of freedom, because that's the level of freedom that I had. And these kinds of films both created and fed this huge sense of adventure for me. And I'm sorry that I don't see those things now, or that are grounded in reality, quote unquote, because how realistic is it that I'm going to find a game cartridge with the microchip on it? I thought that I would when I was a kid, but nowadays it seems like those films, for example, your Harry Potters, are in the fantasy realm, because the dangers of life are too frightening for people, possibly.
Yeah. But I mean, movies of that time period with kids having that level of freedom weren't that far off from reality. I mean, we grew up in the 80s. We know that we did have a lot of freedom, and we could ride our bikes all day with our parents not knowing where we were at all.
I know I did. Definitely. Yeah. We were gone all the time.
I grew up in the country, and so I had a dirt bike. I lived 3 miles west of the little town I grew up in. My best friend lived 3 miles or so east. So I was on my own motorized vehicle, literally miles away from where my parents could help me, or they didn't even know where I was. They had a general idea, but anything could have happened to me in the miles between. And I think about how very little at this point, how little unsupervised play actually takes place. I don't know what it's like for you guys, but can you imagine your kids off on a dirt bike 7 miles away from where you are?
No.
Our kids are constantly imagining that and bringing it up. Dorothy's dream, our daughter Dorothy, who's going into 2nd grade, her dream is just to be left alone, just to wander the streets, finding jobs for herself.
We know from
earn money,
experience
yeah.
it was wonderful.
It really was.
It really was.
It really was.
But I think that specter of Adam Walsh was still more of an aberration at that point rather than, unfortunately, what seems to be so common these days or so widely publicized these days. We're much more connected, so you hear about stories in other states when you may not have when you were a kid. But
Yeah.
it was close enough but not the norm enough to have affected these kinds of movies yet. That would come later.
I mean, I feel like it affected our whole society, and I feel like the movies were reflecting the freedom and possibly Cold War fears and everything, but I do feel like they were indicative of the contemporary, what was going on, and it may have taken a while for the movies to come away from that children in danger after the real child was in the picture, because things take a while to evolve as we go. To this day, I mean, I lost my child in the store, and it was Code Adam was what they called at the store. I mean, it's stuck with us as a civilization to this day.
We still have 2, though.
Yeah, we still have our 2
Yeah.
kids.
Thank you for wrapping that part up.
Sure.
That got really scary.
I just feel like it's something that has really become an iconic memory for all of us, and it stopped being fun to see kids in danger in a lot of ways. I guess it used to be fun to see kids in danger.
So the kids arrive at their destination to pick up the catalogs and the Twinkies, and this is where all of the really Hitchcockian elements kick in for me. Like I mentioned, I didn't see this as a kid, so I'm coming to this as an adult who loves film, and this is the really appealing part to me, where I can sort of play spot the influence and how many times that Franklin is paying homage to Hitchcock. And it begins right here with the ordinary man, wrong place, wrong time scenario. Davy and Kim observe a couple of very Hitchcockian thugs getting on the elevator, one of whom exposes the butt of a gun that's under his jacket, which Davy notices, and of course, as happens in all those Hitchcock films, no one believes him, which I do like in this regard as a kid's movie lesson, because this is the first instance when you realize he's on his own, and this is going to require complete self-reliance.
Because the adults are actively unhelpful.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so is the girl at this point.
We know you got an axe to grind with the Kim character.
So they go upstairs, split up, as you do to take care of delicate secret missions this way, and Davy observes, in a very rear window sort of scene, the first glimpse of the crime that's being committed.
Right before that is when we get the first introduction to Jack Flack in the flesh, as it were. So his long-standing, always present friend.
And we move from this instance of rear window voyeurism straight into another Hitchcock device, which is the delivery of the MacGuffin. Davy is confronted in the stairwell, another prominent Hitchcock element,
Yep.
by a dying man, the man that he saw being roughed up by the thugs that we mentioned. The dying man hands him a video game and intimates that there are secrets on this that need to be protected, and he needs to take it and go.
And he needs to get to the FBI as soon as possible. And I think there's some blood on the cartridge, too. And then we get another Hitchcock element, not just the stairway, but the death down the stairway. The specific way that it's shot feels very Hitchcockian to me. As Davy then watches that body fall through the stairwell, he is running down the stairs, makes it all the way down, and realizes then that he's got to alert the cops. So he starts screaming for the security guard to call the police. This is when we start to see people gather, and then Michael Murphy, the central thug, the person that we saw in the room also roughing up the scientists, makes his way down as well. And he's got a lab coat on, so clearly he works at the Textronics lab. Now, in this moment when Davy is trying to alert everyone that a murder has happened, nobody's believing him right now, and he sees the man who has killed the scientist. It seemed to me like his fear either dissipated quickly or possibly he wasn't able to necessarily convey the level of fear. I don't know what the answer is, but I'm asking you guys as parents, not remembering myself what those emotions necessarily felt like when I was that young, is it easy for kids to sort of switch gears like that? Or was that just maybe an acting choice, or am I missing something?
Well, he was doing it under the direction of his hallucination of Jack Flack. So I think that helps. You know, as a kid, the Jack Flack stuff where he could actually see Dabney Coleman in the flesh as Jack Flack walking around, that always bothered me. That was the one part of the movie that I did not like.
Why is that?
Because for me as a child, it just rang hollow and false, and you know, it suggested if he's actually seeing this person walking around and he can't tell the difference between this guy and another human, you know, I wasn't really willing to suspend my disbelief as to like, oh no, what's his imagination? You know, it was the movie's presenting me with an actor walking alongside other actors, and so I'm just taking it as that's what I'm supposed to be believing that the boy sees, you know.
I am with you, because thinking back to when I watched this the first couple of times when I was a kid, I felt the same thing. I wasn't quite sure what was happening, and there are a couple of moments where the film will do some sort of winking to the audience of, oh, maybe it is real or maybe it's not, and that was really tough for me. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, which is okay when you're a kid.
As a grown-up, I was really thrown off by those moments. I'm like, what is this movie trying to say?
You mean the parts where it would suggest that he was actually like a Drop Dead Fred character? Like he alludes, sometimes Jack Flack alludes to playing with other children through time, and you know, taking on other identities,
or being able to affect the real world outside of just what he's able to do.
Right, there are hints with like, oh, he's moved that cup of tea over here, or you know. Right.
Well, I also noticed that when Davy goes to the security guard and tells him there's been a murder, the security guard does believe him at first. They go to the stairwell and there's nobody there.
The body is gone.
He even says to call the police. He tells the other guard to call the police before he even goes to check.
I really noticed, because a lot of times in those movies, it's like all the grown-ups are never going to believe the kid, and that's happening throughout this movie. But at this moment, for a couple of seconds at least, the security guard believes Davy's story and takes all, you know, emergency precaution to go in and investigate. And then when there's absolutely no evidence there, I think that's part of Davy's reaction too, and ability to switch gears, because he then is really confused and bewildered, because how could it have happened so fast? Maybe he doesn't even know what he saw, and he's a kid who sees his own imaginary friend, so I mean, maybe his understanding of what he sees and what he doesn't see is confusing him at this moment. But I think it's interesting that the real shift happens because there's nothing there. There's nobody, there's no blood, there's no people walking around, and there's just zero evidence to back him up.
Which, by the way, is a little confusing. How did they get down there and get that body and move? Are they like hiding right under the stairs, right off to the side? If they look behind the stairway door, is that where the thugs are going to be holding the body up? But this actually gets to the Jack Flack question. Just the existence of Jack Flack presented as Dabney Coleman interacting with other actors in the scenes. It bothered me so much as a child, but it's my favorite part of the movie as an adult, because I just see it as I have to just cut aside all of the is he real or not? I'm just I'm not going to go with that at the moment, but just thinking of it as in terms of just an aspect of Davy's mind, and Davy just having an internal conversation, or perhaps an internal psychotic episode. I don't know. Either way, I like it. I guess that's my answer to do I buy his reactions? Yeah, because he's crazy. And, and we need the A's.
So the security guard shoos everyone away. He's going to actually send the kids with the police because Davy has caused a big issue now. And as they're being taken away, Michael Murphy then shows up again, and he sees that Davy has left behind his ball, which has his name on it. So now the bad guys know who he is.
So the police bring Davy home, and this is our first opportunity to see what home life is like for Davy and his father. And it is only Davy and his father, because as we soon learn, they recently lost Davy's mother.
And Davy's father is also played by Dabney Coleman. So a fun little bit of stuff to sink your teeth into when you're a little kid. What does this all mean?
The thing I really like about this particular exchange with the police detective is that he still comes to Davy's defense. He's a good boy officer, and the police officer responds with admiration for Davy's tenacity.
I noticed that too.
For an hour, he would only respond with name, rank, and serial number.
Yeah, I feel like it's a very male-centered view and estimation of worth and character. Police are bringing the boy home at night, with the father's just like, oh, thank you, like it's no big deal. But the policeman is talking to the dad and being very like, this was a problem and your son didn't do this. But then they all sit there and talk about how admirable his actions were. So I feel like it speaks a little bit to the male experience or male ideals of the time that were being taught to boys and were really emphasized in this movie.
We were fighting communism, Sita.
We were, and his
Come
not for
on.
nothing, the father character is a military man.
Yes.
And I think about how much that informs the character, a military man of a certain age.
For sure.
They do, however, soon after that invoke the feminine perspective, or at least from Davy's perspective, when Davy mentions, Mom would believe me.
Yes.
So there
That's
is
true.
that element present still, but unfortunately she is not there to voice that because they have lost her.
Although I will say shortly thereafter, Davy does utter the phrase, Jack Flack was right, you just think I'm crazy. So
This is going to be in your treatise later on. Davy is crazy and everything that relates back to that. Well, I really did appreciate, though, that they have a more open relationship. His father, Hal, really tries to get him to talk and work through these issues and not just be so focused on these games that he can't really cope in the real world. And he talks again about maybe it's time to go back to the psychologist that we probably saw at some point after the death of the mother, and understands what he's going through. He says, I was exactly like you. I wanted to be a hero, but as he got older, he realized heroes do different things.
Normal, ordinary, everyday thing.
boring things, right?
There's one interesting point that I thought happened right there that sort of subverts that idea of this macho energy perspective, where you see the exchange when the games get taken away from Davy. You don't see him behave aggressively or act out or throw a tantrum. He simply responds by saying, well, you could just play games with me, Dad. There's not the big fit that I was expecting to see the first time.
And to me, that's the changing in the 80s when we saw dads trying to feel more, be more relatable than just this,
Right.
aggressive, aloof figure.
I do feel like this movie was really trying to present a softer, albeit still very militaristic view of what it was to be a good man.
At the end of that scene, Davy asks to spend the night in the dad's bed, and the dad says yes.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
There's no hesitation. There's no shame involved in it, and I do appreciate that about this movie. It was kind of a unexpected attitude from something that is in other ways so stereotypical and so drawn out. It was like some tenderness that was surprising.
Yeah, it surprised me too.
Brian, you mentioned that Davy has to sleep in his dad's bed, and that's because they get this phone call.
Oh, yes,
a very
right.
menacing phone call. The thugs know where he lives. They know how to find him and tell him so. And
Right.
I was reminded again, this movie is really menacing. There are some scary parts for
It
kids.
is.
For sure.
Kids and adults.
Before we move on, I wanted to come back to you mentioning the dad describing what made a real hero or what real heroes were like because of the boy's concept of this imaginary friend being heroic with all his dangerous, adventurous behavior. The dad points out it's putting dinner on the table, it's doing all these regular everyday dad things, and he's basically describing himself to his son and pointing out what a hero he himself is and should be considered. And I thought that was really interesting, especially given the overarching message of the movie, but also just interesting for a dad who's kind of put upon to be almost like crying out for help and affirmation to his son because he just feels bad and wants to be acknowledged.
And Davy says that he hates him, which I'm sure I said all of that garbage to my parents, and lashes out. And you have to remember, or of course he knows, he lost his wife. Not just Davy's mom, his wife. And when do parents get the recognition for their struggles? Parents never, probably.
Yeah, no,
Yes.
never. And it's interesting because Davy asks his dad to play games with him, and the dad just doesn't even, I don't even know if he even answers him, but he's just clearly like, no, I'm not going to play games with you. And then Jack Black appears and makes fun of the dad, and for the first time, we see Davy react negatively towards his imaginary friend,
Yeah, he
telling
defends
Jack
his
Black to
dad.
shut up and throwing a toy at him and making him disappear. So there's obviously a lot of complexity in the relationship triangle of Jack Black, the dad,
Yeah.
and the son.
Yeah.
Well, the dad is clearly at a loss for what to do. Maybe he has exhausted his patience at this point. He's clearly frustrated. Maybe, as I was about to point out in this next scene coming up the next morning, they're obviously of modest means. When you look at the exterior, he's driving an old used car. They're living in this kind of shabby apartment. And so maybe he's exhausted his financial resources. Maybe he's tried doctor after doctor. Maybe they have dealt with this imaginary friend issue a lot more than we immediately understand.
And he's got to go to work. These aren't rich people, as you mentioned. He's got to go to work. He's got to go pull a double shift as well at the Air Force Base. You know, not an unstressful job. Plus these family issues, which, to think back to, again, to sort of the gender role and gender stereotyping, how many times do we see the single mom have to go through these things, but for the single dad realizing, whoa, this is a lot to have to work through.
So it's the next morning, and Davy's dad goes to work. Davy's left alone in the house, and we see a small scene with Kim and her mother
Who is hot to trot, by the way.
discussing Davy and why Kim likes him. And Kim says,
Because he's the only boy in the neighborhood who isn't boring.
so she values his creativity and imagination.
Sometimes it just can be a little much.
He needs to.
But yeah.
He needs to be a better dungeon master. I think is really
This-
maybe
Yes.
the crux of the movie.
Because she started out saying she doesn't get the good characters,
She doesn't like the games. They're no fun.
so he needs to do a better job. Good point.
This ties into another reason, which I think we'll probably talk about at the end when we talk about why we picked this movie. It's full of these sort of bridge to adulthood lessons, and one of those lessons being sometimes your friends are going to be annoying, but they remain your friends. You stick by them.
She's still got the walkie-talkie. She is ready to go with the next assignment.
And this is when the bad guys show up at Davy's house.
And it is terrifying. The
Yes.
big thug bursts through the door, kicks through the door.
Kool-Aid
It's
Man style.
crazy, yes.
Yep.
And I mean, this is after the father left Davy, and Davy was expressing that he
They're coming to
was
kill me.
in danger, and the dad is like, "Oh, I'll spend all day tomorrow with you.
Yeah. We'll call that doctor to take a look at your
We'll
head.
do baseball camp. It'll be great.
It'll be awesome.
So it's really interesting as a parent seeing this child clearly and concisely stating the danger that he's in and just completely being blown off to be home alone all day long for a double shift all day and all night. We'll find out later in the movie he's expected to put himself to bed that night.
Well, he's got the phone number where his dad is.
Sure, that's all you need.
Yeah, that's all you need.
But only call in
That and a dime.
emergencies.
But minus the imminent threat of people coming to murder me, my situation was similar to that. I did have the phone number in case I needed it. I was left alone for long stretches similar to that.
Yeah.
I just didn't have homicidal maniacs smashing through my door.
Right.
My parents would leave my sister and I for them to go out at night. They would put us on their bed with a movie and a TV dinner, and they were like, well, they're not going to move. They'll just stay right there, so we can leave now. And that was babysitting back in the day.
Another story not to tell Dorothy about, because then that's what she will want to do. And it was great. And he didn't go anywhere, and it was all fine.
So Davy escapes the bad guys and heads to his friend Morris at the game shop to decode this Atari cartridge that he was given. to see if Morris can crack it open and find out what the big secret is.
There's just a moment where he's walking through the mall with Jack Flack, and it says, friendship is a luxury a spy can't afford, and you see that, honestly, Jack Flack makes Davy a little sad, and what he has to tell him is not what Davy wants to do.
Another one of these moments where we're bridging into adulthood, maybe? Leaving your childhood behind.
Well, there are tough lessons to be learned, but you don't have to be a jerk at the same time. You don't have to leave your friends behind. They can become really valuable. And that takes us back to Davy's main friend, Kim, who calls in on the walkie-talkie that the thugs have her, and they want to make an exchange.
So they set up the switch for the cartridge at the Japanese sunken gardens. In the meantime, what the bad guys don't know is that Davy has left the cartridge with Morris, and he has
swiped
a dummy cartridge.
procured.
Under the tutelage of Jack Flack Fagan, he has stolen a cartridge from Morris's shop and is going to be proffering that as the genuine article.
In exchange for Kim.
In exchange for Kim.
You have to commandeer resources sometimes.
Yes. But an unintentional consequence of this is that the cartridge that Davy swipes has the shop's sticker on the back of it. Now, Davy, I don't think, ever learns this, but because he stole this cartridge, or because he was careless about stealing the cartridge and not making sure that it had nothing that would trace back to Morris, he's indirectly responsible for Morris's death. They use that cartridge to track where the real one is and murder Morris for it.
And right before that, we see that Davy escapes, so he gives this fake dummy cartridge, which gives him a moment to get away and get Kim, and she knows, at this point, it's all real. I'm sorry. What are we going to do? Davy is being chased on foot by the thugs, and then we see Morris's death, which at the time when I was a kid just blew me away. Sorry for the pun. It was so upsetting to see the one adult who was really on their side be completely taken off the board. That really threw me.
Yeah, I was really thrown. I can understand being a kid watching it and just rolling with the way that they present the plot points of violence that are happening. But as a parent watching it, and a modern parent watching it, it's shocking to me how cavalierly they present, Morris is dead and you're just gonna be right there next to him, and this is just part of spy life. I also wanted to I was curious, he has the toy gun and he shoots the bad guy in the face with toy gun that's loaded with fake blood. And he's so brave, and has so much wherewithal and courage despite the real world situation that he's in. It's really kind of unusual how collected he is. But yeah, I also had never seen anybody put fake blood in a toy gun. Was that a thing that people did?
Was it a water gun?
I guess so.
I just assumed sort of
I don't know if a water gun would work with fake blood in it.
It was monster blood, so...
So probably.
Should we test that for the side podcast? Myth bust it?
Yeah, there you go.
I did not do that. I had cap guns. I didn't have a lot of water guns.
I had a lot of water guns. We never did fake blood in them. I just thought it was an interesting kind of, a little bit more extreme than his normal way of showing him defending himself in a childlike way, but still kind of jarring and upsetting.
Having a graphic element to it.
Yeah.
I was amazed at how freely they were just shooting at children throughout downtown San Antonio.
Thank you. Yeah, and everybody just kind of walked on by.
Bullets flying everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, I think some people barely noticed, but that's about it. Also, as we go through, we notice that literally everyone in the cast, save Davy, is in neutral, non-patterned, light-colored clothing. So he really stands out in his bright red shirt amongst the crowd when he's running through. You always see Davy. He's even got a bright red backpack, so when he's turned away from you, he's even brighter red.
Useful when you are a symbol of American strength. Not so useful when you are a target on the run.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this chase all through San Antonio leads down to the Riverwalk, and Davy's again trying to get help from these diners who are cracking jokes and more adults who aren't going to be helpful. And he manages to get onto a tour boat, and the thugs are right behind him. And they're playing this sort of game of cat and mouse And I think it's a great moment when they're not going to get on the boat, and then the two people in front are missing their wallets, so then the thugs do get on the boat. I know my little heart was pounding at that point.
Classic.
And this is also where we see the first sighting of Jeanette Nolan and John McIntyre, our old couple. And I wanted to specifically ask the two people who had not seen it as young kids, and especially Cole, who I know recognizes the actors right away, what did you think at that moment?
I knew something was up. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know if it was going to be a red herring, but because of recognizing their faces and the way that the action was framed,
Composed.
with them prominently in the background, I knew they were going to come into play somehow. I was surprised.
And because all the other extras were so deeply unattractive
Or
compared to them.
or the one lady who stared for a split second directly into
To
the
the camera with the weird painted on black eyebrows and the lipstick over her.
Well, Eunice is always so attractively dressed, so she's going to stand out no matter
Eye-catching.
what in this. I guess I didn't necessarily recognize them as anything other than possibly vaguely familiar actor faces. But when she first interacts with Davy, was just relieved because we have this kid running through the streets being shot at, this kid obviously being harangued and chased by this menacing adult. Nobody notices, nobody cares. It's weird to me that there was that tense scene at the line up to the boat because they were willing to chase after him in broad daylight, shooting at him, but a line for a boat somehow stymies them and just makes it to where they're
Sheila,
like, oh.
Drag that ticket off.
It may have been the Cold War, but there were rules.
So I was relieved when finally some grown-up was showing some understanding of this boy's peril. I didn't think that she was a throwaway character. It seemed like there was something to it, but I took her as a benevolent character at first.
Because that's what you think when you see older folks, and she's treating him like she would her grandson, and clearly knows that something's up and wants him to tell her what the story is, and seems ready to believe
She's
him.
not a dumb old lady. She is with it.
He gives her that line of, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you, ma'am," and she says, "Try me." One of the biggest feeling of relief when I first saw that scene.
Short-lived.
Short-lived.
This is also where the Hitchcock connection kicks into overdrive with this couple.
Jeanette Nolan and John McIntyre both have a connection to Hitchcock through Psycho. John McIntyre was the sheriff in Psycho. Jeanette Nolan was actually the uncredited voice of Mrs. Bates.
Oh, okay.
And that Psycho connection keeps going because Richard Franklin, the director of this film, said that he was directly inspired to get into filmmaking because of Psycho. And he became not necessarily a colleague of, an acquaintance of Hitchcock, and visited several of Hitchcock's sets. And then we fast forward a few years, Tom Holland wrote Psycho 2, which Richard Franklin directed. So none of that can be a coincidence. I assume it's all sort of part of that circle.
Everything that's in this movie is very intentional when it comes to references to Alfred Hitchcock's body of work.
Now, on this tour boat, Davy gets his opportunity to escape. So he heads back to the mall with the understanding that this big plan is going down at 5:30. Michael Murphy is supposed to give this cartridge to these foreign spies. So he heads back to the mall. Kim is there in the back room of the gamekeeper. We don't know exactly what happened to Morris, but it can't be good because there's a huge bullet hole through the computer screen. So they break up again. Davy's going to go try to stop this 5:30 transfer plan from happening. He heads back to the Textronics building to find Rice's car, and there he discovers Morris is in the trunk of the car, dead. Now he's got to get into the trunk with the body, which is also another incredibly terrifying moment as well. And this led me to my question for all of you. Did Rice just go back to work while this stuff was happening? Because he comes down.
Yes, he had to, because he is presumably just trying to act like everything's fine, everything's normal, I'm just doing my normal job here. I don't know what happened to our colleague that suddenly went missing. Yeah, he just had to keep up appearances. So
Okay,
sure,
all right.
Sure.
And so then, being in the car with Morris, Rice is taking them to, he doesn't know this, but Rice is headed to the Alamo to make this big exchange.
Jack Flack, when he puts him in the trunk with the dead body, he's very, like, nonchalant, and I just think it's the way that death is handled around the children in this whole movie. I can see as a child it would be horrifying to watch, but it's just not actually played that way in the movie. Jack Flack is like, oh, sorry about your friend, get in there. And
the
it's
cost
just,
of doing business.
Yeah,
as a
yeah,
spy.
and he also even says, your friend wasn't good enough, that's why he's dead.
Yeah.
He's
Jack Black
like-
reminds me a lot of Grandpa Joe from the Willy Wonka movie. I can see Grandpa Joe saying that.
Davy is expected to roll with these changes in this adult world. He's
Yes.
thrown in this
Yes.
to this adult world, and there's no time for him to be a kid.
Yeah, we see a couple of interesting costume things at this point. We have seen a bunch of bad guys in, like, beige and gray and pale colors. Jack Flack is in almost all gray, but it's kind of a blue gray. He has a kind of a slate colored leather jacket and some
It's like a very dark,
gray pants.
like a darker gray.
it's
so
like
maybe
a-
he's
a
like those bad
Gunsmoke
guys, but
gray.
even more so.
It's interesting because it kind of is combining the blue with the gray to where, to me, it's kind of an in-between, like, he's your friend, but he's not necessarily on the right side of things. At this point, Davy has not changed clothes. Davy is still in his red shirt with blue stripes. Kim has changed clothes. Kim has also changed her whole perspective. She is now wearing a red and blue shirt, and it's indicating that she is now more on Davy's page and they're more of a unified team. She has a plaid, lighter red and blue shirt, but it's still more vibrant than anything she's worn so far.
So the action takes us to the Alamo, where Davy is going to try to prevent this exchange of government secrets. He runs into the old folks again that were so benevolent to him on the Riverwalk cruise, and with their help, he pulls the old switcheroo. They have identical camera cases as the bad guy, and so the old folks, it turns out, end up with the Atari cartridge, and as far as Davy knows, the bad guy got the shaft.
This is also not before they don't leave the Alamo before the Alamo staff starts flickering the lights to indicate Alamo's closed, folks. Time
Sort
to
of
go home.
belligerently, in fact.
Sort of
I know.
belligerently, yes.
Get out!
But
There's the exit.
it cuts to the old couple, and so their faces are like lit dark and light for a moment.
Oh.
You don't have to go home, folks, but you can't stay at the Alamo.
Alamo's closed, folks. Moves out front, should have told ya.
So George and Eunice get Davy into the car, and they see again that he has come out on what we think is the right side of this exchange with the cartridge. And Eunice is asking some questions. What do you know about these foreign spies? And Davy says, the only thing I know is he's missing a couple of fingers on one hand. And basically Eunice says, you mean like this? And they're the foreign spies.
Yes, 2 fingers missing. There's chloroform. This scene basically had everything that would have been exciting and dangerous to me except quicksand
Yeah.
as a kid. All
That would have ticked
checked
all
all
the
the
boxes.
boxes.
Davy wakes up sometime later. He is back in that trunk with Morris, and Rice is supposed to be dividing up this money because the spies have exchanged everything. And the thugs are talking about how they're going to ask for more money because they're going to kill this kid. They make the stupid mistake of leaving the keys in the car, and Davy is able to slowly and ineffectively yet effectively escape by driving the car for the first time in the way that you would as a kid.
He busts through that seat like a Terminator, though.
Definitely.
I mean, he just pushes the whole thing over.
Well, Jack Flack was feeding him a steady stream of adrenaline.
I do like that he can't drive. I do like that they don't
Absolutely.
do that
Yeah.
automatic expert thing
Yep.
that happens too frequently.
Definitely.
He can barely even see over the steering wheel.
Yeah, he drives by the sense of touch. As he scrapes
And,
every
well,
wall in the
And Jack
parking
Flack
garage.
breaking the wall of being an imaginary friend, being able to direct him and tell him what's ahead a little bit.
Absolutely. And Davy has also overheard from Rice that Rice has planted explosives at Kim's house, and he's going to blow up this whole neighborhood, and the clock is ticking on this. So Davy has yet another deadline that he's trying to get to, which is to save Kim and prevent the spies from getting away.
So it's a race to the airport. Davy has surmised that the bomb is actually in Kim's walkie-talkie, and they have to go rescue her before they can thwart the other criminals.
Because he sent her to the airport. So that's the mission that she's on.
In the meantime, he calls his dad to try to get help from his dad, and as he is doing that, one of the bad guys smashes through the telephone booth in a van, and here we start to see the process of Davy taking out the bad guys one at a time. Jack Black tells him when the bad guy crashes into the window to take the gun. At this point, Davy still refuses.
And Jack says, you are going to have to kill the bad guys. You're going to have to do this. And you can't go right to the objective. That's no fun. You've got the killing people is the fun part.
It's Cloak and Dagger for real.
And we see Kim is now in a purple cardigan, and we can tell it's a lavender cardigan, and she also has lavender pants on. She still has her red and blue shirt on, but to me, the extra color that doesn't show up anywhere else is kind of putting her in this third role where she's not an equal as much. She understands the goal and she understands the danger, but she's off on her own little part of the dangerous scenario.
Well, we see her on the bus, and it zooms in on her bag and reveals to us that she is carrying the walkie-talkie with the bomb. In another scene that directly echoes Hitchcock, specifically the film Sabotage, in which we see a young boy unknowingly transporting a bomb on a public trolley. And this gets into that whole thing about surprise versus suspense, and how much more effective suspense is than surprise. Hitchcock cited the example of you show a couple having a conversation at a table and a bomb goes off. You've got 15 seconds maybe of surprise. But if you show a bomb under the table and make the audience aware of it, and that it's set to go off at 1 o'clock, and then you show a clock in the background at 12:45, then you've got 15 minutes of suspense, which is entirely more effective.
And they do all of those things in this. We're constantly looking at different clocks and different people speeding towards the same objective. But in the meantime, Davy's still got more bad guys on his tail. He's got Rice and Alvarez, and they're about to head back to the Riverwalk under a bridge, and Jack tells him he's going to have to use the Crossfire Gambit.
The old Crossfire Gambit.
Again, relying on his ingenuity rather than having picked up a weapon.
Mm-hmm.
This is also a moment where Jack Black breaks the wall, or it seems to me. He's smoking and drinking espresso, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But then the bad guys come and put a briefcase on the table, and they knock espresso off of the table in an otherwise vacant area. So it seems that it's Jack Black actually had some espresso.
That's one of those winking
Yeah.
moments that I wasn't sure what to make of when I was little. But
Yes.
gave me some delight.
And somewhere around here, Davy skins his knee. Skins his knee so bad that it tears through his jeans, and you see him bleeding through his jeans, which is foreshadowing one of the most terrifying moments in maybe all adventure film for me.
Yeah, that speech is
Coming up soon.
frightening.
Yeah.
Well, let's get there.
Well, Alvarez is taken out in the Crossfire Gambit, and Jack Black finally convinces him to take the gun this time. He takes Alvarez's gun, but runs off in the opposite direction that Jack tells him to go, toward a dead end, where Michael Murphy corners him.
This is with loads of guilt and horrible things said by Jack Black, saying like, you know the rules and you're no fun, and how many people have I killed for you? This is what you've always wanted. Really terrible imaginary friend.
And the real life bad guy is talking about how he's going to slowly murder Davy in a terrifying, terrifying way.
Michael Murphy explains to Davy that he's not just going to kill him, he's going to shoot his kneecaps off. And
Kids film.
in kids film, and then he's going to shoot him in the guts and let him slowly bleed to death in the worst agony that a human can experience.
The phrase shredded meat is used.
Shredded meat.
Kids film.
Kids film. Yep.
So you can see how Davy's left with no choice except to defend himself at this point.
Davy says, please stop, I don't want to shoot you. And Rice says, but I want to shoot you. Jack Black is saying, what would a real hero do? And he previously has said, if you're not going to save Kim, who will? And it's a very loaded, horrible scenario for an 11-year-old boy to be.
But ultimately,
placed
Jack
in.
Black has to save the day here because Davy seems paralyzed and not able to finally pull the trigger, even after all this has been said.
He's 11.
Jack Black, off to the side, I'm not even sure what is he preparing to do.
I do a soft shoe. I can't.
Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen over there.
But because Davy keeps averting his eyes over in that direction, Rice starts to believe that Davy must have some secret ally hidden off in the shadows.
Odd
It's not in the shadows. It's in a lit up area.
Yeah, but it's making him just take his eyes off Davy. And,
Yeah,
Davy's holding the gun at him.
a lit up wall. He just shoots a wall. Right.
Davy's holding. Yes, that's right. He shoots at a wall because Davy shouts out, Jack, no, something along those lines.
So Rice believes in invisible friends.
Well, Davy's very persuasive.
Well, Jack sacrifices himself / tricks Davy into shooting Rice.
Davy also drops the gun. The camera poignantly points to the gun, sadly clanking to the ground. Kind of reminded me very much of how he drops the baseball when he first sees the technician murdered in the Textronics building. And so I don't know if dropping the baseball is Davy losing his innocence. I'm not sure what dropping the gun is losing.
Ditching the evidence.
Ditching the evidence.
Maybe losing his hope.
Perhaps.
Oh.
Yeah.
That just really got to me there.
Well, it's definitely what this whole sequence is about, because he not only is dropping the gun, he drops the action figure and stomps on it, basically turning his back on everything that's come before.
Yes.
And killing Jack Flag.
He kills Jack Flag by stepping on the figure. Jack Flag was fine. His soft shoe routine saved him from the hail of bullets from Rice's weapon, but then when Davy steps on the figure, blood begins pouring from various bullet holes. And with a very confusing statement of, "Oh, it's so sad when I have to leave when they don't believe."
Once again, Davy completely
He
racked
fades away.
with guilt for all the culpability of the murders and deaths that happen around him.
Was there a kid better in the 80s at suffering loss than Henry Thomas? I can't think of one who did it better than he did.
That's good.
Tellingly also, Jack Flack says, "Your father said the same thing."
Yeah.
Not a dry eye in the house. So Jack Flack sends him on his way with no hope, and Davy has got to get to the airport on time. So he has headed out to look for a taxi or somebody to take him there. That's when we see Louis Anderson in his sleeveless Western shirt. And he gets Christopher Guest's brother to drive him to the airport.
Oh yeah, just some helpful stranger on a busy city street. It's fine.
In the meantime, Kim's mother has found a note that she left detailing her whereabouts, and Davy's father has come over to find out what's going on, and they are now all headed to the airport for this grand finale.
And Kim is there already, and she's trying to get the police to pay attention and realize the threat that is imminent at this point. And Davy arrives as well and spots George and Eunice and tries to get a security officer to get over and stop them. He's faking that they're his parents. And in the meantime, while this is happening, George and Eunice figure out what's going on, and George starts to take hostages, Davy included, and starts shooting up the place. And takes everybody out onto the tarmac. He's going to commandeer a plane. Also one of those 80s things, hijacking was huge when I was a kid as well.
And they even say they're going to take them with the plane to take them to Cuba. They had previously been planning to go to Mexico City, but they switched to Cuba at this point. And also at this point, somewhere in this, Davy grabs the walkie-talkie away from Kim, and before he can explain what it is, because George and Eunice don't know anything about this was just a device of Rice's, they've unwittingly got a bomb on the plane as well.
And Hal and Kim's mom have arrived, and Hal is the only person who is going to be able to fly this plane right now or be able to do something. So he puts on a captain's hat and heads out to the plane.
He also, at this stage, he's always been wearing his uniform, which is pale blue and navy, so it kind of is in line with most of the other neutrals that don't stand out. But I found it interesting because the only other person that's wearing that bright red is the air traffic controller that comes in through the side door, and it's like, I can't stop it, I can't do anything, I don't know what to do. And in effect, Davy's dad takes his place because they switch through that door, and I felt like it was kind of symbolic of him coming over to now being on the red side, being Davy's side of righteousness.
I like your thing about that, because that guy in the red jumpsuit always was jarring for me, because he wasn't an essential part.
We've never seen him before. He has a line all of a sudden. He has a line,
but anyone could have said that line. Like, oh, they're demanding a pilot. Anyone could have said that, but they have this guy come in this bright red jumpsuit carrying the bright flashers. And then Davy's dad walks right past. They trade places, and then as he heads out to the tarmac,
So Davy's father fakes his way onto the plane, acting as the pilot who is going to take them to Cuba. George and Eunice are occupied with him while Davy is trying to disarm this bomb that is quickly counting down to 0. He can't manage it. Jack Flack is not there to tell him which wire to cut.
And Hal knows that he only has so much time because he can't actually take the plane up into the air. So
he can only taxi it. He can't fly it.
And he's got to get Davy to safety, so he uses the Jack Flack gambit to try to get Davy's attention, which doesn't quite work. Exactly.
Davy's busy.
Yeah.
I think Jack Flack's non-presence in this scene is really interesting because the mantra has always been Jack Flack always escapes, Jack Flack always finds a way, and Jack Flack at this point is effectively dead, yet Davy saw him bleed to death and say, "You're a man now, I'm gone, I'll never see you again," but he's still asking for Jack Flack in all earnestness, like, "Where are you? Come here, I need your help, please, please, please." And it's just radio silence from Jack Flack in this moment.
It's kind of like a Jesus thing. It's like, "Father, why have you forsaken me?"
Well, I think it's really illustrating the transition of Davy learning that he needs to rely on his real life father as opposed to his imaginary construct of a father.
Yeah.
And realizing that the imaginary friend is not always going to be there, but that his dad is a real life flesh and blood person that can be there when,
Okay, well, we got to show this.
Doing all those ordinary things, like you mentioned, doing the laundry, paying the bills,
but also
flying a plane.
Counter-espionage. Boring.
Outwitting foreign spies.
But before that, we do actually have the disembodied voice of Jack Flack saying, "It was always you, Davy. It was always you the whole time," to give him that internal strength to call upon.
Which, because of the espresso cup, we know is a lie, though. So, very odd. Yes.
We'll remedy this in Cloak and Dagger 2,
okay.
Our upcoming script. So Hal has used this gambit to try to get Davy up to the cockpit so he can get him out. And he does some fancy maneuvering and shoves the throttle forward so that he can get the crooks off balance and get Davy up into the cockpit. And that's when Davy's finally able to show Eunice, "Hey, there's a bomb in this thing, see you later." Runs up to the cockpit. Hal is able to get him out the window. That's the second time Ray almost gets run over because he's got to drop off. That's the
third time.
Got to do a big shoulder roll out of the way.
The dad is all, "Be sure to roll away from the plane as you hit the tarmac." Like he barely hears him, but thankfully
his
Davey
training
was paying
kicks
attention.
in. Yeah. The film doesn't end with him getting run over by a huge plane.
That's a good thing.
And he stands up and he sees the plane going further and further away, and then the huge explosion happens, and then we see Jack Flack coming out of the big fireball, and then it turns into Hal, and he says, "I don't need Jack Flack anymore, I've got you, Dad." The end. It was fairly abrupt for me. Pretty explosion, there's Dad, and everything's fine.
Well, I think it's all wrapped up at that point.
I guess everyone is dead.
I think you watching it as a child, probably, kids always want a little bit more. Kids always want more explanation. I didn't feel any kind of abruptness. I was all like, "Yep, that sounds about right. That's where it ends." It was very, non-abrupt for me.
All right.
As the first time I watched this as an adult, that scene was maybe my favorite because there's the explosion that no one could walk out of. Jack Flack begins to come out of it. It's definitely Jack Flack's silhouette. And then, for me, Davy just decides what kind of crazy he's going to go. And he decides to go crazy in the direction of, "My father's still alive, even though I know it's not true, and I'm just going to hallucinate Dad coming out of this fireball."
So you think no one survived? that explosion.
Right. And he's in his
Yes.
hospital room.
Well, I think Davy's alive, but I think Davy now just is going to, for the rest of his life, just be talking to Ghost Dad.
Right, sorry, he's
And,
in his
yeah.
padded room.
Padded room, yes.
Reliving this moment that he's created. Okay, all right.
Or, just going on a cross-country insanity spree with his imaginary father. Yeah.
And Kim.
Yeah, Kim's
Kim wouldn't find that boring.
Okay, interpretations. All right.
Okay, with the film all wrapped up, this is when we usually discuss why we chose this particular film for the episode. So, since you guys brought this to us, Brian, why did you select this film? Why does it stick with you after all these years?
Well, this movie to me gets to the crux of a lot of what in literature, fantasy films, what's childlike and what is childish. With childlike being the good aspect of childhood, wonder and sense of adventure, and childish being the bad side, immature, ridiculous on its face. Modern comics, there's been a schism that's occurred, where if you go into a comic shop nowadays, there's infantile comics that are aimed at 5-year-olds and under, and then there's comics aimed at adults only. Obviously, when they created these comics, they were thinking, well, we're going to have, the ones for kids, and we'll have the ones for the adults, and at least that way the comics won't be childish, is what they were going for. But the comics are childish. The ones for adults are more childish than the ones for the children, because they've got all of the adults-only elements. They'll have, like, all the, extreme violence and nudity, language, whatever, but none of it's in the service of the storytelling, or I should say very little of it is in the service of the storytelling. There are still great comics that are for adults only. I don't mean to say there aren't, but for decades, these comic companies were coming up with these long, flowing stories that could be read by anybody, could be read by kids, could be read by adults, and it was this amazing shared experience that just went on and on and on.
It sounds like when you're talking about those kinds of stories, it makes them ripe to revisit. So it gives you something to read at different levels depending on where you are in your own life.
Yes.
And so this film exists in that realm of true family entertainment that doesn't exist in particular in these comics that you're talking about, where there's something for every reader, and so it appeals to you after all this time because it retains that?
Yes. As extreme as this movie is, even with the kneecapping and everything, it's possible for younger kids to, be in the room. I'm assuming. We haven't experimented with our own children with this, but it's possible for kids to not really understand it all, not really to take it all in. It's possible for some of it to wash over them, and for it to actually only get more and more horrific as you get older, as this certainly is the case with me watching it.
Well, I saw this movie when I was 8, and there were enough surprises and those what if questions that would keep me thinking long after I saw it and keep me interested. And I had a thoroughly wonderful time when I saw it, and I remember my mother actually really enjoyed it too. And I came back to it as an adult and realized, oh, I actually liked this because it is well made. There's an interesting story. The stakes are as high as they possibly can be.
Yep.
So that's something to get really invested in. And I have enjoyed watching it the multiple times that we've done it now together for the show.
I think I was just a hair too old is why I missed it the first time. I was 14 when it came out, and I think it really is perfect for 10 years old. In 1984, when it came out, my favorite movie that year was Pope of Greenwich Village.
Sure.
For example. So I really left that behind. But this movie is a perfect vehicle to bridge that gap, I think. This is why I would have chosen it for the episode. A, for all the Hitchcockian elements in it, because it's just fun to spot those. But B, because it seems like a real bridge from childlike ideas to adult ideas. It is helping you move from one phase to another to make it not so scary. It's all about mastering fear and using fantasy to overcome your anxieties as a way of processing danger.
And I really appreciate stories about relying on your own ingenuity and your own skills. And I respond to that so much, again, as an only child, that truly at the end of the day, you only have yourself to rely on. While it's wonderful to have a family who believes in you and friends that will go on those adventures with you, you still have to be the master of your own decisions and choices.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's interesting that you say the only child part, because I have an identical twin sister, and I actually respond in almost the opposite way, because it just makes me so sad that he's constantly told that he's the only one that he can count on, and that he's separated from everybody, and everybody lets him down, and all this stuff. And I'm like, oh, why does he have to be alone? Why is this weird message about you only have yourself in this world? Because I always had someone with me. I always had a partner in crime, as it were.
I played Uno by myself.
Did you win?
I would play the hands as they were dealt.
My mom was an only child. She made faces at herself in the mirror.
Well, you've talked about how this genre doesn't seem to exist anymore, the children in danger. And the children are in danger. I mean, there are, in real life, there's ever present just from the news, the threat of like, oh, somebody could shoot up our school any day. We just don't know, And so I feel like it's more important than ever that this genre might be brought back.
True. I hadn't thought of that, because now that you say that, I think the equivalent of the Kids in Peril movie would be something like Gus Van Sant's Elephant, or something truly horrifying like that doesn't have these sort of exaggerated cartoon elements, even though the stakes are high, but something that is actually dealing with a true tragedy that kids this age might be going through.
Well, comics have been used that way since the beginning. I mean, Captain America was put in place because people didn't have a hero to look towards. There was World War II going on and all this stuff.
It was a full year before America's involvement.
And I mean, they always point out in comic retrospectives that that's why comic heroes were needed, because people needed something to focus their fears in a hopeful fantasy kind of way to help them process what real life was like and how to keep moving forward. And we live in a time where it is very scary for children, but for some reason, children's media has gotten far away from putting children in the hero roles and putting children in like a intelligent protagonist role.
Yeah, instead it's just more like messages about how can you get by if you and your wealthy twin brother are on a cruise boat constantly.
Well,
what do you do?
The one example I think of, you saying that about how they're focused these days, made me think my favorite kids film from the last decade is Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, which definitely prioritizes ingenuity and creativity, but the stakes are zero. There's no danger. And I love the movie. It's one of the most entertaining things I've ever seen, but it is vastly different. The cultural landscape has changed so much that I do wonder if they actually could ever make a movie like this again.
Well, I think, again, to a different type of media, and my favorite stories beyond the Harry Potters are the Philip Pullman trilogy, His Dark Materials. I love that series, and those stakes could not be higher, and talk about the nature of the soul, and is there a God, and so on and so forth, and mortal peril as well. And I think, again, about the conversation we've been having through this film about accurately and equally representing genders in heroic roles as well, and those feature a female protagonist. And I imagine that you guys also had those thoughts in the creation of Pathway Comics as well.
Yeah, I mean, things are getting better, but there's still a long way to go, a lot of road to recover.
We have this giant Marvel Comics poster in our house, 50 inches by 50 inches. It shows all of the most of the minor characters from Marvel back in the 1980s. And it's a great poster, but it's mostly dudes. It's a lot of dudes. So, yes, we've got this new series, The Dimensionals. They're preteen all-girl superheroes. Let's see. What to tell about The Dimensionals?
It's our original comic that we're creating as a team. Brian is doing most of the art and writing, and I'm kind of a finisher with coloring and final edits on some of the visuals and dialogue. And we're creating it really as a response to being parents of children who want stories where children have agency, and children are able to be solving problems that actually matter, and children are in charge of the things that they are capable of being in charge of. Our children read a lot of things that are out of date, are not current, and we actually don't have a lot of the current stuff because it's just not that interesting or good storytelling. There are a few exceptions, but I mean, our daughter has grown up reading Depression era comics like Little Orphan Annie and Little Lulu, and she loves them because those children have freedom and agency and authority over their own actions, and also are heroes, and they're girl heroes at that. Everyday regular little girl heroes, and they love things back in the 80s. One of Brian's big influences
That's right, the series Power Pack with 4 child superheroes. That a series that you might be able to say, if you looked at the series as a whole, it got very dark because there's lots of life and death stakes, there's massacres that happen that they have to deal with, there's terrible things, but it's also like every page just dripping with wonder and excitement and high fantasy.
So we just find that our children respond the same way we did to stories and media that are from a long time ago. And we don't find compelling stories as much in things that are being created today. We do
very clever things, lots of clever things happening.
Yeah.
But
and there's some good stories, but there just aren't enough, and we want to be part of the solution there.
Yeah.
And how does the Dimensionals do that?
We have 4 girls. They're young. They're aged from about 7 to 12. They're regular everyday girls that end up being imbued with very special powers. We're tying in current interest and just a lot of fun information by using STEM-based powers. Their powers are based on actual science properties.
With still loads and loads of just making stuff up, too. Yeah. Well, no, it's funny because, you look at, like, all the comics. You look at, like, the Fantastic Four back in the 60s. It was decades ahead of its time. There were decades before they could make a film of any of it because the concepts were so out there. The visuals were so beyond what filmmakers could handle for many, many years. But the characters were stodgy even then. The powers were stodgy even then. And the stock, characterizations were stodgy even then. I mean, Mr. Fantastic was just Plastic Man, but serious. And, the Thing was one of the monsters that they'd been doing for the decade prior. So, yeah, it seems like there was time to, like, poke around a little bit at some of the science that's floating out there. So, yeah, all their powers are based on weird and surprising phenomena that happen with subatomic particles.
What I think is interesting about the powers that you chose is because by basing them off of something in reality, albeit a very obscure, unknown reality to most people, you are putting limitations on their powers also. I think you as a comic reader have gotten frustrated with someone like Superman or the stories getting derailed by the writers constantly revamping just what the parameters of their powers are and just changing them kind of arbitrarily for however they want to write the story or whatever they feel like they should do. And I like that the powers that you've given the girls have finite edges to them and their capabilities. Even though they are capable of a lot, they also have limitations built in.
Yeah, gotta have the Achilles heels in there.
One of my favorite details, aside from the fact that they have weaknesses as well as strengths, is that you also, in their profiles, denote what their favorite reading material is.
Yes, that was my favorite part.
Well, we want them to be relatable to the kids. I mean, our kids love reading, and we also just obviously love books.
Now, guys, full disclosure from me. I have never read a comic.
Wow.
Of any kind, of
Not
any
even
length.
like Archie or a You've read comic strips.
I've read a comic strip.
Have you read the books of comic strips?
No.
In your defense, you have
I was playing Uno for one.
You have the raddest Incredible Hulk TV tray circa 1978.
Oh boy, that's for sure.
That I've
Mom needs
ever
to
seen.
hand that
Is
over
it the
to me.
same one that we have? 'Cause
They stole ours, yeah.
We
That's-
have an Incredible Hulk.
It is the
tray.
same one.
It's the
I've
same
seen
one.
it.
Okay.
Whoa.
We got it in
Nice.
1978. I ate every single meal off of it. My mother will not give it to me.
Oh, no.
I had a similar experience to you, I think, in that I started with Little Lulu, Hot Stuff, Richie Rich, all those Harvey comics and things like that. And then I graduated to Archie. And then from there to DC. And then when I moved into my teen angsty phase, I went from DC to Marvel. And these days, the things I really enjoy most are Fantagraphics, drawn and quarterly, stuff like that. Chris Ware is a particular favorite of mine. So I've sort of made an evolution through that myself, but I see exactly what you were saying about how you and your kids like to read those things, that they exist sort of out of time. They age really well, and that there's always going to be a kid who's going through that situation. There's a real universality to those Harvey comics and things like that that I think ages extremely well.
I think I'm gonna save my first comic for the Dimensions.
All right.
No pressure.
No pressure.
So you guys have the finished product ready to go?
Yeah, we have our first issue ready to go. So you can find us online at pathway-comics.com. We've got our first issue available, just $5. We'll also have, for $10, an issue with some original art etched into the back.
In August, we'll be in Killeen at a small Comic-Con called Geek Fest.
That's right, put on by Central Texas College. It's August 12th, 13th, 14th.
And it's a great little con done by at the college there, and it's actually like pretty appropriate for kids as cons go. Our kids had a blast last year, and there's a lot of booth members who have their children there too. I think it's a kind of gentler environment because it's smaller and because it's at a college. And so we'll have our comics there available for sale.
That'll be like the big debut, the big public debut right there. And
We'll have them in hand.
I'll also be emceeing a comics jam table where anyone can come up and sort of it's like a round robin storytelling thing where each person does a panel, like writes and draws their own panel of a continuing story.
So we can get the whole adventure started at pathway-comics.com.
Yes.
Well, the last thing we usually do on every episode is we make a film recommendation for further viewing that is at least tangentially connected to the film that we discussed in the regular episode. So, do you guys have recommendations for us today?
Yes, we do.
All right. What are they?
Mine is a movie from 1994, just 10 years after Cloak and Dagger, that's very similar to Cloak and Dagger, called Fresh. It's a story of a 12-year-old boy in the city. He has kind of an absentee father who... His father kind of unknowingly gives him the skills through teaching him chess to take down a whole group of drug dealers and evildoers in his neighborhood that have shot his young girlfriend. And he also, for much of the movie, wears a red t-shirt and has a little backpack. And it's just a very similar movie, but doesn't have any of the 80s lack of severity, of consequences, of, oh sure, get into a trunk with a dead body, it's not that big a deal. Fresh is a much more serious take on a very similar story.
Oh, okay.
But something I think maybe the mid-teens would get a lot out of. It'd be like in the 13
Yeah,
or 14
it's not for
age
kids.
range. It's not for 10-year-olds maybe. But, well, my recommendation is actually it's not a film yet. But I'm very hopeful. Steven Universe, for me, is, if anything is out there picking up the torch of this. You know, the Steven Universe animation seems very fluffy and very silly, and it is, but that's just the surface of it. It's very life and death stakes. We're still struggling whether or not we can let our kids watch that one yet.
Kids are very sensitive to high stakes situations.
And yet we want to teach them survival skills and let them use fantasy to build strategies that can get them through crises in their lives.
Yeah, that's one of the modern,
That's one of the few modern things.
stories.
And unfortunately, the comics for Steven Universe, although they're wonderful comics, they go in a whole separate direction from the film. So
the
from the shows, the TV shows, yeah. Although I've had to give total props to those TV shows, the comics
Or a bit of a letdown.
Just not. They're very. They're going in artistic directions, and they are trying not to step on the toes of the storytelling toes of the show, so they don't tell stories in the same vein, really.
My recommendation is a film that came out 1 year after this, and my mother and I, as I often talk about on the podcast, went to everything together. So we dashed out of this, and then the next year went to see Young Sherlock Holmes from 1985, which was directed by Barry Levinson, starring Nicholas Rowe, Alan Cox, and Sophie Ward. And as the title would suggest, it is the early adventures of Sherlock Holmes as imagined by Steven Spielberg and Chris Columbus and Barry Levinson. And I was enthralled by this movie as well, and got the best advice ever from the theater attendant before we went in, which was stay to the end of the movie. And I felt like I was initiated into some secret club after that.
Well, I'm going to wrap up the recommendations by taking us all the way back to the beginning in the source material. And I'm going to recommend The Window from 1949, which is the first time that the short story that Cloak and Dagger was also based on was adapted for film. It was directed by Ted Tetzlaff, based on the Cornell Woolrich story, The Boy Cried Murder.
Cornell Woolrich, of course, being another Hitchcock connection as well.
And starred Barbara Hale, Bobby Driscoll, and Arthur Kennedy. And it's about a boy who happens to see his normal, quote-unquote, neighbors kill a sailor. He tells his parents about it. His parents don't believe him. They force him to go over to apologize and tip his hand. And then the bad guys are onto him.
Yeah, and then during this whole time, then as his punishment, he gets locked in the house, thereby being bait. It is a great one. I love The Window. The Window is so much fun.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that the kid in peril thing doesn't change that much over the course of several decades sometimes. A quick note about the director Ted Tetzlaff and Hitchcock as well. 3 years before he directed The Window, Tetzlaff was the cinematographer on Notorious, which also featured one of my favorite MacGuffins. Instead of an Atari 5200 cartridge, uranium ore that the Nazis were going to get.
So, as always, another round of great recommendations. We've got Fresh and Steven Universe, Young Sherlock Holmes, and finally, The Window.
And that brings us to the end of episode 26, our first anniversary episode.
Happy anniversary.
Thanks. It has been a really fun year doing the show. And we would just like to say thanks to everyone so far that has taken the time to listen and give us feedback. And we want to give extra special thanks to Brian and Sela for being our very first guests ever. Please check out everything that they're doing at pathway-comics.com. And if you are anywhere in the Central Texas area, go see them at the GeekFest Con in Killeen, Texas from August 12th through the 14th. And check out issue number 1 of their new comic, The Dimensionals. You can also easily find them on Facebook and Twitter. Just search for Pathway Comics. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can reach us at magiclanternpodcast@gmail.com. We are on Facebook and Instagram. Just search for our name there. You can find us on Twitter at lantern_cast. I would like to take a second and say thanks to everyone who has shared links or given us feedback since our last episode. Mateo Boscarol, Craig Eastman, Tim Lego, Grindhouse Dave, and especially Jeff Duncanson and Geza Laszlo for all the great insight about La Cienega. Thanks for listening, and thanks for letting us know what you thought of the film. You can listen to the show on iTunes or Stitcher Radio or Google Play for you Android users. We would certainly appreciate it if you would like to leave us a rating or review. Another person left us a very nice 5-star rating this time around, but no accompanying review. So let us know who you were so we can say thanks for that. And finally, if you would like to check out all of our episodes, including supplemental material, you can find that stuff at our website, magiclanternpodcast.com.
And thank you for listening to the Magic Lantern Podcast.